Welcome, everybody. My name is Robert Barton, and I'll be the host for today's Woodland Owner Lunch and Learn webinar, Creating and Maintaining Upland Habitat. A couple little housekeeping things before we get started. First of all, if you are looking for the slides for today's presentation, you'll find them on the Forestry webinar portal on the page where you joined today's session. If you scroll down, you'll see them under the related files. Also, as you heard, this is a recorded session. The recording will be available for viewing on demand here within the next few days. So if you want to review it after participating live, you'll be able to do that. Or if you know of somebody that wasn't able to participate, you can always refer them to the webinar portal where they'll be able to watch this on demand. We'll be taking questions and answers today. Please enter those into the question and answer feature. You can click on that icon there at the, you'll see it says Q&A. Go ahead and enter your questions in there, and we'll be answering those questions towards the end of today's presentation. So to get started, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Jake Comer. He is the Farm Bill wildlife biologist with Quails Forever. And with that, Jake, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Like you said, I am a Farm Bill wildlife biologist with Quail Forever. Quail Forever is a nonprofit habitat organization. We focus on improving habitat not only for upland game, but also helping landowners interested in habitat management across their property, no matter what you might be interested in. But before I begin, I do want to, let me see if I can get my slide to click. I do want to talk a little bit about what my duties are as a Farm Bill biologist. My primary duty is to visit with landowners and help those landowners provide or enhance habitat on their property. I do this by providing management recommendations. These management recommendations can then be used by private landowners to gain assistance in cost share opportunities. And I'll kind of go through some of those opportunities at the end of this presentation. But in addition to helping private landowners in their habitat management goals and objectives, I also coordinate and participate in different outreach events, such as this webinar, to help educate landowners in how to better manage their forest land, and then what cost share opportunities are available to them that can help them meet those goals and objectives. This position came about from an initiative titled the North Carolina Woods for Wildlife Conservation Initiative. And this initiative strives to engage more woodland owners in forest management and certification, enhance habitat for species of conservation concern, and promote the conservation of imperiled habitats, including longleaf and bottomland hardwood forest. This initiative has various different partners with just support and from financial support. The initiative focuses on a 14-county region. You can see there in the diagram in the southeastern portion of North Carolina in those green counties. Just because if you're listening in and you might not be inside of those counties or inside of North Carolina, there are biologists within state and federal organizations, also with non-government organizations such as Quail Forever, that can help you in developing your habitat management recommendations and helping you get enrolled in some of these cost share programs. So this presentation's we're going to look at just the wildlife and timber importance in the Southeast and in North Carolina, and then look into why private lands are so important in maintaining the wildlife and timber revenue that comes from this area. Next, we're going to kind of look at the needs that wildlife have on these private lands in the Southeast, and then how to meet those needs using active forest management techniques. And then finally, we'll go over some cost share opportunities that exist for landowners interested in implementing some of these conservation practices. So to begin, the Southeast is highly diverse in wildlife. All 13 states that make up the Southeast rank in the top 23 nationally for total number of wildlife species. And one of the major reasons this is because of the longleaf pine ecosystem. The longleaf pine ecosystem is one of the most diverse ecosystems in our country. which is why which is why all these southeastern states rank so high. It's home to many of our iconic wildlife species. A lot of your sportsmen and sportswomen go after big game such as deer and turkey, which really thrive in this habitat. And many people are very familiar with the whistle of bobwhite quail, which is so iconic in longleaf pine ecosystems. And then the red cockaded woodpecker, which many people know is a federally threatened species. And then all the way down to the base level of the food chain, and that being pollinators. You can see in that bottom left picture, well-managed longleaf pine stands really benefit pollinators. And many upland birds and songbirds, such as the Bachman sparrow, there in that middle picture on the left. In addition to the importance of wildlife in the Southeast, timber is also highly important. In the past, longleaf used to make up the majority of the southeastern landscape, and this was used mostly for pine resin products such as tar and pitch. That was then used along the eastern coast in naval stores to help build ships during the earlier times. Recently, there's been a shift in timber focusing on more saw timber and wood products such as paper, which has really caused a shift from longleaf to loblolly pine since these pine resin products aren't really as needed. The Southeast in general is referred to as America's wood basket. It contributes to 57% of the nation's wood, up to 1.1 million jobs and $230 billion in regional economy. And because of this reason, whenever you're managing for wildlife on a property, you always have to keep the importance of timber revenue or timber income to a landowner in the conversation, because so many landowners rely on this revenue source for income. So whenever you're managing your land, there has to be a happy medium between managing solely for wildlife and solely for timber. These two considerations can be managed together well, but if a stand is being managed specifically for wildlife, that stand is more than likely going to look a lot different from a stand that's being managed just for timber. So the first thing that I like to do whenever I visit with landowners is just talk to them either on the phone or in person if possible, just about where their priorities are with their land. That way we move forward. We know where this happy medium is between wildlife and timber value. And the reason it's so important to identify this with landowners is because of how much of the Southeast is privately held. 9 out of every 10 acres in the Southeast is privately held. And then in North Carolina, it is just slightly less, with about 85% of the land being privately held. This means that most of your habitat and wildlife reaction or any change to habitat is going to be largely dictated by private lands. This also means that there are a lot more parcels to manage than whenever you have large chunks of land that are managed by federal or state agencies. So now that we've kind of looked at the importance of wildlife and timber and why private landowners have such a big role in meeting these two needs, we'll focus on what wildlife really need in those forested ecosystems. And the first thing that most of you landowners are going to think about is the food that is present on their property that's available to wildlife. One of the most thought of food sources is hard mass. And these hard mass is just hard-shelled seeds such as acorn, hickory nuts, walnuts, pecans, any of your hard-shelled nuts. These are generally produced in the fall and have a high calorie content, in addition to having a high fat content, high in carbohydrates and protein, which make them a very energy-rich food that can be found in the winter months whenever other food sources may be less scarce. The problem with hard mass is it does have variable production. Some years you'll get a lot of acorn drops, and then some years you might not get very many at all. With this variability, wildlife populations that solely rely on hard mass and only have hard mass available during those winter months may have a more difficult time surviving or may not be as fit the following spring. The second food source I want to talk about is your soft mass. These are your perishable fleshy fruits that are high in sugar, vitamins, and carbs. The soft mass is normally present in the spring and summer, and this is what helps your animals gain the fat and store the carbohydrates that they need to prepare for the winter whenever that food is less abundant, especially if they're going to be relying on that hard mass, which is variable. That buildup of fat is very important in the spring months. And then the one that I'm going to focus on quite a bit and is one that is most commonly managed on a larger scale is your ground forage. Your ground forage refers to the browse that you see on the forest floor. It consists of grasses, forbs, and shrubs. And generally, this ground forage is highly dependent on disturbance. Disturbance events that come through disturb the ground and creates a lot of new growth, which is referred to as early successional habitat. And simply put, early successional habitat is defined as habitat with vigorously growing grasses, forbs, shrubs, and trees, which provide food and cover for wildlife. I mean, we'll go into how to get adequate ground forage for wildlife on your property. But in that definition, I mentioned that this ground forage provides cover, which is the next need of wildlife that I want to focus on. Cover is needed by wildlife, especially for your upland species, specifically quail, because they need a place to escape predation. Normally, quail aren't going to venture too far from shelter habitat just because the risk of predation is so much higher. In the winter months, this cover can be used to escape harsh winter events such as ice storms, where some of your smaller upland species have a hard time maintaining their internal temperature. The next need is water. Most of the time, water is thought of on a large scale, being rivers, streams, lakes, which not all landowners are going to have on their property. But I encourage you, whenever you're looking at the water sources on your property, to think at even a smaller scale than your lakes, rivers, and streams. Think on scales such as these small pools that might hold moisture throughout the year. You may have some pools that hold moisture in certain times of the years and are dry in others. These pools can be vitally important for amphibians and other wetland obligate species that rely on these areas to migrate across your property. Even on a smaller scale, you can think of droplets of water such as dew. Many insects might rely on this. Your birds such as quail, upland birds, a lot of times they get their water requirements from the food that they eat, mostly from your soft mass, that fleshy fruit. They can also get it from insects and the seeds that they eat. They have a really good ability to extract the water from their food and meet those requirements. I would also encourage you, as you go through your property and you see down logs, those can actually serve as a place of water source, maybe not necessarily for a drinking water source, but serve as a place of moisture. During drought events during the summer, those down logs, a lot of amphibians or insects can crawl under there and have an escape area out of the heat and out of the dryness, and gives them a place of high moisture during those drought events. And then the last need is space, and your food, cover, and water is really going to be what dictates the amount of space that wildlife need. Another name for space would be a species home range. Home range is an area over which an animal or group of animals regularly travels in search of food or mates. Like I mentioned, this is driven primarily by habitat. Normally when it's not driven by habitat, it's whenever the species that you're managing for on your property are in search of mates. But normally whenever they're in search of food, cover, and water, they're going to require less space with better adequate habitat. One of the driving factors that a lot of research has gone into recently is habitat fragmentation. This is one common thing that you see a lot of that dictates the amount of space or the home range of an animal. One of the most common examples is a housing complex being placed in the middle of a rural landscape. This really blocks up the habitat, and then the amount of space that it requires for wildlife to maintain those needs, being food, cover, and water, dramatically increases. In addition to being able to effectively search for mates, where they once were able to travel with ease across a property, they may be hindered due to these man-made structures such as housing complexes. But there are other things that have fragment habitat more than the noticeable construction or housing complexes. And one of these things could be tree plantations. The tree plantations are generally managed for uniformity and therefore don't have much diversity on the forest floor. They don't have a lot of the ground forage that you see in more diverse managed stands. And they normally have a tight overhead canopy. These plantations are maximized for timber income and normally don't have much wildlife decision process involved. And in some instances, landowners have to manage for these plantations because they're relying on the income from their timber stand. But a lot of times there's better ways to manage timber stands on a landowner's property where they can gain some type of wildlife or aesthetic value from the land, which is a driving factor in why a lot of landowners own their land. So now that I've kind of talked about the needs that you would kind of look for on your property, I want to review how to maintain those needs as well. One of the first often used management techniques to meet the food, cover, water, and ultimately less space of wildlife is prescribed fire. Prescribed fire can have different outcomes depending on several factors. The first factor that I want to talk about that affects the outcome of a fire is the timing. Your two most common types of fire are your dormant season burning and your growing season burning. Dormant season burns generally are in the winter, December through March. They are better in stands that don't have a long history of fire. These fires are much cooler in temperature in alternative to the growing season fires. And then in these stands that don't have this long history of fire, there's normally a thick layer of pine litter that is on the forest floor. And because this fire is a lot slower, they have a lot higher ground temperature because they reside over the same place over the ground longer than a head fire, which I'll talk about later. But this can really be utilized to remove that thick pine litter, which will expose bare mineral soil. And to have that ground forage or ground growth or early successional habitat, the first requirement that you need to have is to expose bare mineral soil. When bare mineral soil is exposed and sunlight reaches that bare mineral soil, that's normally whenever you get the reaction that you're looking for in your upland species as far as the early successional habitat that they require for their food and cover. One of the problems with dormant season burning is it doesn't encourage the forb and grass growth that growing season burns do. A lot of times landowners will have a lot of problems with hardwoods sprouting in their forest stand. These hardwoods monopolize the sunlight and make it difficult for the sunlight to reach the forest floor and create that early successional habitat. Whenever this is the case, growing season fires may be needed in order to create that early successional habitat. Growing season burns normally occur in April to July. Before I begin talking about growing season burns, I just want to talk about the risk of a growing season burn. Growing season burns are very beneficial to wildlife, and in stands where it is safe to do so, or in stands that have a long history of burning, growing season burns are generally going to benefit your wildlife species more. In stands that haven't been burned, a growing season burn has a higher risk of wildfire escape. If there's a thick layer of pine litter on the ground, you have a higher risk of damaging feeder roots from your pine trees, resulting in tree mortality, which is one of the major concerns of many landowners whenever you talk about doing a prescribed burn. is the amount of tree mortality that occurs. But if conducted right, your tree mortality is very minimal, and your chance of wildfire escape is also very, very small. If your stand is not in the condition that it needs to be for a growing season burn, that doesn't mean that it never will be. Several dormant season burns can be used to remove the pine litter on your property, get your hardwoods under control, help bring your mid-story back down. That way there's not as high of a risk for wildfire. And then after you've done several of these dormant season burns, your property may be a perfect candidate for a growing season burn. But going into a growing season burn, these burns are done in April to July. They have a lot better reaction from your native warm season grasses and forbs, have a lot better effectiveness rates with controlling hardwoods. The flames generally are a little bit higher, which can kill your hardwoods. During this time, your hardwoods are actively growing. So if that flame gets to those buds, it has a lot better chance of killing it than when you perform a dormant season burn. Another benefit of a growing season burn is that some of the native warm season grasses and forbs that a lot of upland wildlife species require fire to disperse their seeds and to also sow their seeds. By exposing that bare mineral soil at the same time that the native warm season grasses have their seed heads, that seed is allowed to hit that bare mineral soil and encourages their regeneration. The next thing I want to talk about that will influence the outcome of a prescribed fire is your burn interval. Burn intervals are the amount of time in between your fires. Normally your birds and songbirds are going to prefer shorter burn intervals, and larger game are going to prefer longer intervals. However, a burn interval of 2 to 3 years really encompasses the greatest swath of wildlife. So if you're managing for overall wildlife health, a 2 to 3 year burn rotation may be best on your property. The burn interval is so important because this is what really influences the control of hardwoods on your property and also the encouragement of grasses and forbs. As you can see here in that diagram, A is a control, and then as you move from B, which is a 3-year interval, C, which is a 2, and D, which is a 1-year interval, you can see the reaction or the change in understory growth. A, you have a lot more hardwoods. As you can see, there's a lot more shade being casted, which doesn't allow the grasses and forbs to be regenerated like you see in D. Normally, your C and B is what a lot of landowners have on their property just because of the difficulty of performing a prescribed burn every single year. Also, this burn interval, once you are able to kill hardwoods, or if you do kill them, if you go on a longer burn rotation, some of your hardwoods may become too mature for fire to kill. So having that lower burn interval is one of the reasons that keeping hardwoods under control is so important with that shorter burn interval. This table here, I really like this table because it simply puts very common wildlife species in North Carolina and the fire frequency that they prefer. And as you can see, most of these wildlife species have that 3-year fire interval in there. I generally like to plan for a 2-year burn interval for landowners that are interested in wildlife management. And that's just because if you plan a 2-year burn interval, a lot of times it'll become time to burn. A lot of landowners have other jobs, so they take a weekend or a day off to perform a prescribed burn. And a storm system moves in, the wind changes, and the weather that you need to conduct that prescribed burn no longer exist. So if you plan on a 2-year burn interval, normally over a 10 to 15-year average, you'll be looking at a 2.5-year burn interval or longer, just because of natural events and you just not being able to conduct the prescribed burn whenever you want to and having to push it off another year. Where if you plan for a 3-year burn interval, whenever those weather events would happen, you would be averaging a 3.5 or higher burn rotation, which a lot of times a forest stand can get out of control. The understory can get too high and make a burn not possible on the land. So that's why you kind of want to burn a little bit, or plan to burn a little bit shorter interval than you might originally want, just to account for those weather events. And then the last thing I really want to focus on about the outcome of a fire is the intensity. There's several different ways to get different intensities of fire. One of the most commonly used techniques is a backing fire. These are lit along the baseline of a fire break on the downwind side. These fires creep into the wind at a very slow pace. This burns up a lot of your ground litter and really is beneficial on a stand that hasn't had a prescribed burn conducted on it before. Just for the fact, like I mentioned, it removes that pine litter and exposes that bare mineral soil, which is going to encourage your food and cover that your wildlife are going to need. Another technique that is commonly used are strip head fires. And this is similar to a backing fire in that the backing fire is lit along the baseline and allowed to creep into the wind until you get a solid black line or a black area behind that. Then someone with a drip torch laying down a fire line will go shortly ahead of that backing fire and run a strip across the property parallel to the backing fire. This allows the wind to really catch those flames, and these flames generally are a lot higher than your backing fire and move with a lot. They move a lot faster across a property. This can be beneficial when you're trying to top kill some of the hardwoods on your property. And generally, whenever those two flames, your backing fire and your strip head fire, meet, that's where your flame intensity is going to be the greatest, and you can have good control of hardwoods whenever that occurs. Another technique that's not very often used on private lands are just straight head fires or ring fires. Whenever a ring fire is conducted where these flames converge, you have a high probability of killing a lot of your mature timber. The flames can be so intense that they come out of the top of your trees, and they also don't leave any escape path for wildlife. So you can see with these three different techniques, you can get three very different intense fires. And depending on what you're trying to manage or what the outcome of your prescribed burn is the technique that you're going to use. If your outcome that you're looking for is to remove a lot of pine litter or duff on your forest floor, you might want to use a backing fire to help remove that. If you're looking at a lot of hardwood control, the strip head fires may be more beneficial. Not all properties are able to have a prescribed burn conducted. A lot of these reasons could be from suburban development. A lot of them arise from smoke management issues. If a road is built on your property, say on the south side of your property, a lot of your winds in the winter are coming from the north, and this can make it very difficult to conduct a prescribed burn without smoking up the road and having a lot of liability issues. So in places where prescribed fire can't be used, herbicide may be a great alternative. Herbicide can be used to control a lot of your hardwood species that monopolize that sunlight trying to reach the forest floor. You can spray your hardwoods with a selective herbicide that'll leave your grasses and forbs untouched. In areas where the mid-story is too high and a prescribed burn has a high risk of getting out, an herbicide treatment may need to be used before the prescribed burn in order to bring that fuel load out of the mid-story and back down to the forest floor to minimize the risk of wildfire. Another reason that I've seen for herbicides to be used when you're looking at your property and the ability to perform a prescribed burn, always consider your confined animal operations. There have been several problems with smoke getting into some of poultry houses, and a lot of times you can coordinate with the landowner or the owner of that confined animal operation and try and plan your prescribed burn during times whenever turkeys or chickens may not be inside of those houses. But if that's not possible, herbicide can be used instead of fire on those stands with very good outcomes, increasing the food cover increasing water through the increase of food, and then ultimately requiring less space for wildlife to use on your property or having to use on your property. Now that I've talked about prescribed fire and herbicide, I really want to focus on thinning because your prescribed fire and herbicide is going to be used to expose that bare ground. But exposing that bare ground really doesn't provide any benefit to wildlife species if you still have a closed canopy. The requirements to create that early successional habitat is the disturbance, which exposes the bare ground, and then the light reaching that bare ground or bare mineral soil. So whenever you are thinking about thinning, just a general rule of thumb is the more sunlight that reaches the forest floor, the more ground regeneration you're going to have. If you look at the picture on the left, you can see that this pine stand has been burned, but just has a pretty bare forest floor. Where on the picture on the right, you can see the individual shadows from the trees. You get a lot more ground growth after this. And this is where the biggest median is going to have to be found between your timber income and the wildlife benefits that you have on your property. Thinning really low is really great for wildlife. Thinning down to basal areas of 30, which I'll talk about how we really measure the success or how we measure a thinning. Thinning really low is great for wildlife, but for future income, you take a lot of the trees that are on your property that could be saw timber in the future and you remove those. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you leave every tree on your property and don't thin it very low, you might be managing for quail. But if you only thin it down to a 90 basal area or something with a lot of pine trees left, you just won't get the reaction or outcome that you're looking for. So this is whenever it's very important to keep your objectives and goals first, to think about them. I really don't go into defining objectives and goals. That could be a whole nother presentation because defining those objectives and goals are so important to landowners. That way, when decisions are being made about how to thin or what to thin or even what type of fire or interval to do, those decisions are a lot easier. But going into thinning, most landowners are going to thin their forest stand generally whenever the tree growth starts to slow down. Whenever the tree growth starts to slow down, the growth is getting too crowded, and some of those trees need to be removed. Whenever you remove these trees, you really want to focus on the damaged trees or some that have something wrong with them, such as forked, they're bent, those that may have fire scars on them. You really want to remove those trees first and leave the other trees room to grow, to develop into saw timber for your future income. If you are managing for specific species such as the red cockaded woodpecker, always do a survey of the property. There's plenty of professionals that would be more than happy to assist you in that. And you might need to leave some of those trees for them that they may be using. So you heard me mention earlier the term basal area. Simply put, basal area is the measurement of the cross section of a tree at breast height within an acre. So this would be if you cut the tree off at about 4.5 feet and took that cross section of every tree within an acre and totaled it up. You heard me say a 90 basal area. This refers to 90 square feet per acre. To get this measurement, foresters will use a 10-factor prism. As you can see here in the picture, that prism refracts the trunk of that tree to the right whenever you're looking at it. What you would do is go to a representative point on your property that best encompasses that timber stand. You would stand and hold that prism out 25 inches in front of your face. Generally, there's a string on these prisms of 25 inches that you would just hold on your cheekbone. And then you would point this at one of the trees on your property. If that tree's trunk is refracted outside of the trunk of the tree above and below that prism, it would be an out tree. So you wouldn't make a tally, as you can see there in that left image. If the trunk of the tree inside the prism is not refracted outside of the trunk above and below, you would count this as an in tree and just make a mental tally. If the tree is a borderline tree, you would just count every other one. And you would do this and you would spin 360 degrees around a pivot point. That pivot point is the prism. It's not the person taking the measurement. So if you were to do this on your property, make sure to spin around the actual prism, not around you. You would get a more accurate measurement. But as you spin around, the trees that are further away from you would obviously be out. So as you get a feel for it, you wouldn't have to sit there and look through every tree that might be 100 yards away. You start getting a feel for the area that you're going to cover. But as you spin 360 degrees, you would count all the trees that had their trunks that were not refracted outside of that prism as they're in the middle picture. So if you spun around and got 6, because it's a 10-factor prism, you would multiply that by 10, and you would have 60, which is a 60 basal area or 60 square feet of that wood in the acre. And the reason this is so important is because it directly relates to the amount of sunlight that reaches the forest floor, because it directly relates to canopy cover. So whenever you're talking to your consulting forester or whoever you have conducting your timber sale, you can specify how low you would like a thinning conducted to based off of your objectives. Thinnings, you can specify thinnings of 70, 60, 50, or higher in 80 or 90, depending on what you're wanting to get out of your thinning and the reaction of habitat that you're wanting until your next thinning. A lot of landowners don't have 10-factor prisms laying around their house, so a good rule of thumb is to use your thumb. Whenever you're out in the field, instead of holding a prism, just hold your thumb out in front of you. If that tree is wider than your thumb, you would count it as an in tree. If it is a borderline tree, it would be just as wide. And if it is an out tree, the tree would be thinner than your thumb. You would just spin around 360 degrees and do this to every tree and tally up the total number of in trees. This isn't as precise, but for general landowners, it gets pretty close and lets you go out to your land without a forester and kind of see if you're wanting quail on your property and you don't know why. If you go out there and take a basal area measurement and see that you have 100 trees per acre, this might be one indication of why you might not have quail on your property, just because that sunlight or the canopy cover is too high and not allowing sunlight to reach that bare mineral soil, which is really going to encourage that ground growth, which a lot of your upland species really needs. Then there comes a time whenever a landowner has to make the decision to clear cut. A lot of clear cuts happen whenever forest stands reach maturity and landowners need that revenue. A lot of landowners own property for retirement, college savings, for a variety of reasons, all the way just to have some extra expendable income. Clear cuts aren't bad. They set back successional habitat. I know a lot of people look at clear cuts and see just a nasty picture. But there are ways to conduct clear cuts that are beneficial to wildlife. Like I said, this really increases that successional habitat growth. One of the ways that you can improve clear cuts on your property is through a seed tree clear cut. And this is whenever several trees are left on your property to reseed the area. And a lot of times this is done with loblolly pine because they generally reseed themselves a little bit better than longleaf. The time of the clear cut is really important for these seed tree cuts because they produce seed in the fall. And if you perform a clear cut before seed fall, then that seed's not going to be mixed into the ground. And you can see there in the back of that picture what might be a seed tree cut where they've left several trees. But oftentimes clear cuts are done on private lands and all the trees are removed that way to gain the most financial return on investment. The reason clear cuts aren't that bad, well, let me talk about this chart. I really enjoy this chart here because it shows the stage of growth from your bare field, which would either be an ag field or in this case a clear cut, and then how it changes to grasslands and grass shrubs into pine forest. So as your trees mature into that pine forest, the reason it's so important to maintain that disturbance is so that early successional habitat between that grassland and grass shrub habitat can be maintained. Um, as you can see here in this clear-cut picture, the regrowth during that first year of 2009, you can start seeing it come back and all the way from 2010 to 2011. And that first 3 years after disturbance is whenever a lot of your wildlife species are going to benefit from that ground disturbance. There's going to be a lot more palatable forage on the ground for your wildlife. But generally, after those 3 years, your growth gets to be too big, as you can see there in 2012. And a lot of your wildlife species won't use that area anymore. Because after about 3 years after a clear cut, it's very important to consider what you're going to replant before you ever perform your clear cut. Because as you can see there in 2011, that would be a great time to go in there with a prescribed burn or herbicide if you weren't able to conduct a prescribed burn or the fuels weren't there. That would be a great time to go in there and set back that growth. But if you haven't replanted the right tree, setting back that growth might not be possible. So whenever you're reconsidering or considering what you're going to replant before your clear cut, your objectives and goals should always be revisited. If you're wanting to manage for these upland species, you're going to want to plant a tree species that's well adapted to the disturbance events such as fire. If you plant loblolly, those trees are nowhere near as resilient to fire as longleaf. You can see here this longleaf stand is about 6 years old. A prescribed fire was run through this area on a landowner's property to help control with loblolly regeneration. A lot of loblolly had come up into that stand and really started choking out the native ground story. A little bit of hardwoods was also located in pockets of that stand and was really maintained by performing that prescribed burn. So if that landowner would have gone with loblolly, not thinking about his future objectives and goals for his property, he may not have been able to, or he wouldn't have been able to conduct a prescribed burn on his land, and his objectives and goals would not have been met. Another thing that I try to encourage landowners to do, it's not always an option for landowners, but if a landowner has a large chunk of property that's uniform and they're only wanting to cut half of it, say that they have 200 acres of mature forest that they're wanting to cut half of for some income, consider doing some non-uniform clear cuts. Generally, if you can manage for non-uniformity, you're going to have a lot more diverse wildlife on your property at all levels of management. If your prescribed fire is non-uniform, doing it in odd-shaped blocks, small blocks, burning some one year and some not the other year, anything that you can do to really increase the diversity of your management is going to improve wildlife on your property. But if you have a 200-acre block and you're only going to cut 100 acres, instead of splitting that block in half, I would recommend to try to do some non-uniform shape clear cuts on 50 acres of the 100 acres in 2 different spots. That way you can manage for that non-uniformity. And then lastly, I just want to talk about some cost share opportunities that exist for landowners to maintain this upland habitat. This will include a lot of practices for prescribed burning or herbicide. Not all the practices are going to be listed, and I go through quite a few, so don't be overwhelmed or feel like you need to remember which programs provide which opportunities to landowners. The first financial assistance opportunity that I want to cover is a state-administered cost share through the North Carolina Forest Service. The goal of this program focuses on timber production and the creation of the benefits associated with active forest management. For landowners to be eligible, they're required to have a forest management plan that's approved by the North Carolina Forest Service. These cost share practices that are cost share at 40 to 60% include site preparation, tree planting, and forest stand improvements, which it would be something that's a pre-commercial thinning, where if you had loblolly come up in your longleaf pine, they would cost share for a hand crew to come in there and remove those loblolly. And the next one I want to just briefly cover and make you aware of is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Partners Program. The goal of this program is to promote and implement habitat improvement projects that benefit federal trust species, provide conservation leadership, and promote partnerships, encourage public understanding and participation, and to work with USDA to implement farm bill conservation programs. This cost share opportunity focuses on private landowners. It provides technical assistance and planning. U.S. Fish and Wildlife have great biologists that would come out to your property and help you come up with this habitat management plan that would then be used to gain cost share assistance through the Partners Program to implement your habitat improvement. Another one that I want to briefly mention is from Audubon, North Carolina, and it's the Forest Landbird Legacy Program. This focuses or guides and supports land management and habitat restoration to benefit forest birds. It really focuses on mature stands of timber 50 years or greater, and normally 50 acres in size. There are exceptions that exist depending on the surrounding landscape, such as if it would back up to a nature preserve, publicly owned land, or different factors. But this program is really for landowners looking to manage for forest birds on their property that need that mature timber. They may need some dead snags on their property, but really can't take that loss of revenue in creating those dead snags. And this is a program for those landowners and can contribute up to 75% of the cost of implementing some of those practices. And then finally, I want to talk about farm bill programs. These programs are what I am directly involved with day in and day out. That initiative that I mentioned earlier, the partners that I listed, or the other cost share opportunities that I previously listed, they are also partnered in this initiative and provide the cost share assistance. So I do work with those partners trying to find the best cost share opportunity for landowners. But these farm bill programs is what I work with on a day in and day out basis with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS. The first program that I want to mention is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP. This can pay 75 to 90% of the cost and really focuses on one-time practices, very specific practices, such as site prep, tree planting, the pre-commercial thinning. There's a really long list of cost share practices that can be cost shared. Some of the ones that benefit wildlife species or upland species would be conservation cover, where native warm season grass establishment is covered. Pollinator habitat can be covered. And really these one-time practices for landowners wanting to implement or plant these things on their property for one single year. The next program is the Conservation Stewardship Program. This focuses on long-term enhancements for landowners that are interested in doing enhancements over a series of years. An example of this would be short interval burning or sequential patch burning, where either a landowner wants to burn at very short intervals at every other year, or sequential patch burning, where if they had a large piece of property that they were burning all at once, but they wanted to block it up into 3 separate blocks and burn a different block every year. This would be a better program for that landowner that could help pay for some of the cost of getting that prescribed burn completed. And then finally, the Farm Bill program I want to briefly talk about is the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. This is the one that a lot of landowners are going to be most familiar with, and it really focuses on restoring agricultural land. These are normally 10 to 15 year contracts where, at least in the southeastern region, a longleaf pine are planted on these agricultural lands, and landowners receive soil rental payments for the lifespan of that contract. This Farm Bill program is administered by FSA, with a lot of the technical work being done by NRCS. I do want to say, like I mentioned before, I started going over that. That was a very brief overview. A lot of these cost share programs are very complicated, especially the Farm Bill programs. And that's why we're here to help. We're resource professionals from any of those agencies listed before. They're in and out of this on a daily basis. They can keep up with the rule changes and how eligibility changes, and can really help you whenever you decide, or if you decide that you want to navigate cost share assistance and find that program that best fits your objectives and goals. And I, again, want to stress keeping those objectives and goals in the forefront of your mind is so important, because all these cost share opportunities have different schedules of implementing practices. So if one of these cost share opportunities doesn't fit into your management schedule, it might not be the best fit for you, and there may be another opportunity. For the landowners that may be listening that are just beginning, I just want to, or even the ones that have been doing this for a long time, I want to remind you that forest management is active management, that the reaction that you're wanting to see may not occur after one burn or one management activity. And just to stay persistent in your management techniques and following your management plan, that way you can start to see the reaction that you're looking for. Here, I included just a few contacts that you can visit. The Quail Forever biologist, I'm currently the only one in North Carolina covering those 14 counties. Other states do have Farm Bill biologists. The North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, they have biologists in each region. They have technical assistance biologists that focus on visiting with landowners and helping them develop those habitat management plans that can help meet their objectives and goals. The North Carolina Forest Service, they were one of the cost share opportunities that I mentioned. They have foresters that can come out to your property and help assess what the next steps are to do on your property. And then also the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. They have contacts that can help you navigate some of these programs. But regardless of who you contact, a lot of times the first step in maintaining or creating this habitat is just a conversation on the phone with somebody. Even if it's not the right person, a lot of times they can direct you to the person that can help you best meet your management goals. I do want to say my contact information is there at the bottom. After this presentation, if you have any questions about your property, if you're in that region or in North Carolina, or are just unsure of where to start, please feel free to give me a call or an email, and I'll help you out however I can, getting in contact with the right person. That way we can improve habitat across the Southeast and help meet landowner objectives and goals. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions if y'all do have any.
Jake, thanks for the presentation and everything. We have time for questions and answers. Please remember to enter your questions into the Q&A feature here of Zoom by clicking on its icon, and you can enter your questions there. Currently, we have a few questions in the queue, so let's start with those. The first question is from Nancy, and she's asking, it says, seems like the clear cuts are herbicided, so some of potential benefits lost. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that is correct. A lot of times clear cuts are, for lack of a better term, nuked. A lot of the competition is sprayed, and that vegetation is set back and not allowed to grow. A lot of them have what they call a pre-emergent. This keeps your hardwood and waxy trees from coming up for a year after your trees are planted. But that's just the most commonly used herbicide. And there are herbicides that you can use that won't damage your native warm season grasses or your bunch grasses and forbs. So some of your clear cuts, yeah, you would be correct in saying that they are sprayed and limit the amount of native vegetation that can regenerate. But if you have your objectives and goals clearly defined and you're talking to the person that's going to be doing your site prep spray, A herbicide recommendation can be made to meet your habitat recommendations and meet your objectives and goals. So there's more than one way that clear cuts are sprayed.
All right, the next question is from Zainab Matu, and they're in clear cutting, whole areas is felled to obtain new forest by adopting different types of regeneration. How this ecosystem is affected. Can you please throw some light onto that?
If I understand the question correctly, just how the ecosystem is affected after a clear cut. So like I mentioned whenever I was talking about those clear cuts, generally if you could do that seed tree and keep some of the habitat that is there, that would be the best option. Another option would be to not cut your forest, to leave it as a mature stand. Allow a variable age growth. You could have mature trees. You could come in and thin it heavily and come in and plant some trees underneath in the open areas. Longleaf are a lot more shade tolerant. And this would displace wildlife a lot less than performing a complete clear cut. The reason I really wanted to talk about clear cuts is because of their use. Most landowners don't have a choice but to use clear cuts. So it's really not as much of not using clear cuts or choosing not to, but it's out of necessity. So yeah, wildlife are displaced, but if correctly managed very shortly after, especially if you leave places of refuge, those wildlife will return back to your property and the benefits can continue through a whole nother rotation of timber.
All right, next question is from John Varner, and he states, I have heard there are possible issues of managing for quail due to invasive species, example, armadillos, coyotes, and fire ant increases in eastern Alabama. Do you believe this is true?
Yeah, so I get asked this question a lot. A lot of times landowners will ask my opinion on why quail numbers are going down. And I wish there was a silver bullet answer. I know a lot of landowners probably get tired of hearing that because they won't, and I would love it if there was a silver bullet answer. But what I can tell you is the biggest reason for quail numbers decreasing across the entire Southeast range all comes back to the habitat. The habitat is being fragmented more so to favor predators than to favor quail. So therefore you have a higher amount of predation, but that isn't the only reason. If you can increase the habitat that quail have in the food and forage, escape cover, and make that habitat more beneficial to quail than to say your coyotes, you would be better off on your property. Another thing I want to mention about the coyotes, predator management is necessary in some instances. But you also have to think about a lot of your mesocarnivores, your raccoons, possums, and house cats. A lot of these species are the ones that really predate on the nest and can cause sharp declines in upland, especially upland bird species. I'm not sure about the armadillos. Where I currently located, we don't have any armadillos. So I really don't, I couldn't speculate about that. Fire ants, that is an increasing concern. I've heard that more and more recently. I do know, I have seen some studies that look at fawn mortality with that. And a lot of it seems to be more opportunistic. With that said, I'm not 100% sure that it might not contribute. But again, the biggest factor that needs to be focused on in restoring quail numbers is the habitat. And that habitat will in the end encourage quail survival and decrease predation at the end of the day.
All right. So one question I can answer, and this is from Captain Jim McKinney. Can we get a copy of your PowerPoint? The presentation slides are available on the Forestry Webinars website on the web page for today's webinar. And I've also posted that link into the chat window. So you can click on it there to get to a PDF of today's presentation. Next question is from David. They state they have coyotes, but they're wondering, is it possible to have wild quail?
Yes, for sure. And like I said, it would depend on the number of coyotes. A lot of times landowners see coyotes whenever they're dispersing, but generally coyotes are so hard to control just because they're a territorial species. If you remove a coyote from your property, nature in general doesn't like a vacuum in a niche. So if you remove that single coyote from your property, more than likely you're going to have another one come in. So it's always consistent. I would encourage you to look at the raccoon, possum, house cat numbers that you have on your property as well. And if you have an abundance of those, which is probably why you would have an abundance of coyotes, you may want to, if you're going to focus on predator control, look at those nest predators too. If you take out all your coyotes, your possums and raccoon numbers are going to skyrocket, which in the end, you might be taking out coyotes, but you really aren't benefiting predation on quail. But again, I just really want to stress creating that habitat first for quail to escape that predation, giving them plenty of nesting habitat. A lot of their nesting habitat now, especially with the advancements in agriculture and farmers having more time to clean ditches, the herbicide used in ditches. These borders and ditches are a lot more narrow than they used to be. And this just creates an ecological trap for quail. They'll go in these areas because they are such great nesting and brood rearing habitat. But they're also really good habitat for a raccoon or possum to go through in just a single night. So by increasing the amount of space that they have to nest, it makes it harder for those coyotes, possums, raccoons to find those nests, and therefore should increase survival on your property.
All right, folks, it's just after 1 o'clock. I want to take this time to thank Jake for giving his presentation to us today. I apologize if we did not get to your questions, but it is time to wrap up today's webinar. And Jake, thank you for taking the time to put together such an enlightening presentation and everything.
Yes,
Folks,
sir.
thank you for participating. Go ahead, Jake.
If I just want to say, if anyone is listening and has any questions or just wants to talk about